So one thing that I had to, there is a mistake here that I had to fix, and that was Associate Professor Phil Parker. So I changed that. So that is the show. So yes, Emma is all yours.
Thank you. Alex. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm delighted you're here to watch me attempt to squeeze 3 years worth of work into what I hope will be 30, but what's probably going to be more like 40 minutes. That said, I'm on the edge of the caffeine threshold, so we could get to 40 minutes. During which time I'm going to present the 4 studies in my thesis. So I have presented to IPPE a number of times before, and most of the time I'm talking about the same thing. So it will come as no surprise, I'm sure, that my thesis is about life goals or aspirations, and so is therefore today's presentation. And life goals have a really broad and long history within psychology, within psychological research. Basically, the take-home message is usually that life goals are good for us. Indeed, people who are able to identify and strive toward meaningful and relatively achievable goals report more well-being than those who are not working towards goals. But much of that evidence also focuses on more of the kind of process elements of goal pursuit, the how will I achieve my goals, and by when will I achieve them, and how am I going toward them. And a process on the process factors associated with goal pursuit has an important blind spot. Namely, it ignores the content of your goals, which is sort of the what am I aspiring to do. And that information is an important determinant of the extent to which your life goals predict well-being, or so holds goal contents theory. A goal contents theory says that there are goals of 2 types. The first is extrinsic goals, and these are dependent on external contingencies, on feedback from the environment, and are reflected in goals for things like wealth and fame and image. And an orientation toward life goals of this kind reflects more of a controlled psychological process and, in some cases, psychological threat. In contrast, intrinsic aspirations are reflected in things like personal growth, giving to the community, close relationships, and physical health. And orienting toward goals of this nature naturally engenders your basic psychological need satisfactions, and in that process promotes well-being. But despite nearly 3 decades worth of evidence in goal contents theory, which is this theory of aspirations, it's one of SDT's 6 mini-theories. Despite robust, long-term, cross-cultural support for both the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations and the differential extent to which they each predict well-being, it appears that some members of the jury are still out, particularly when it comes to the commonly reported finding that extrinsic aspirations correlate negatively with well-being. Some authors have suggested that in the West, so in countries such as our own and in America, an orientation toward extrinsic aspirations, particularly toward wealth, is reflective of greed, of an orientation toward overabundance, and such an orientation may explain why over-orienting toward extrinsic aspirations is detrimental to well-being. These same authors contend that in countries with developing economies or loosening political ideologies, often it's Eastern Bloc countries that are discussed, they suggest that perhaps the developing structure of the economy means that people who are orienting toward extrinsic aspirations, particularly toward wealth, that may be demonstrable of a felt prosperity, an experience of hope, and that kind of orientation may protect people from the otherwise detrimental impact of relative extrinsic aspiring. Indeed, there's some evidence that supports such a claim. One study in particular juxtaposes an American sample with a Polish sample, finding in the American sample that a relative orientation toward extrinsic aspirations is detrimental to well-being, and in the Polish sample, that was not found to be the case. The Polish were not impacted negatively if they had a relative extrinsic orientation. But there is also evidence from other Eastern Bloc countries that suggest the opposite, that support the goal contents theory, operationalization or conceptualization of life goals. So how do we settle debate of this nature? We could, collect more samples and run more analyses and repeat, but it's been going on. Obviously, this research has been collected now over many decades and many studies, so at this point it may be more useful to synthesize the existing evidence and look at moderators of the link between aspirations and indicators of well-being meta-analytically, which is what I did in study 1. So this first question here is concerns the pooled effect, the pooled links between intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations and indices of well-being and ill-being. Now, you'll note that I'm talking about links here, plural, and that's intentional, because obviously the aim behind a meta-analysis usually is to find a single kind of key central pooled effect size. And the generation of such an effect size in a study such as this would involve transforming or reversing the data to put intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations on opposite ends of a continuum, and doing the same with well-being and ill-being. And there's evidence to suggest that such a procedure is not appropriate. In particular, intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations are actually normally positively correlated. If coefficients are usually kind of 0.1 to sort of 0.3, which indicates that there's something, it's weakly, obviously a 0.1 correlation is very weak, but it indicates that they're similar, not opposite ends of a spectrum. And it's the same with ill-being and well-being. More recent evidence suggests that indicators of well-being and indicators of ill-being have separate biological markers. They're independent psychological phenomena, not opposite ends of a spectrum. So based on those two lines of evidence, this meta-analysis basically kind of includes like 4 mini meta-analyses, one for intrinsic to well-being, intrinsic to ill-being, extrinsic to well-being, and extrinsic to ill-being. And then I looked at demographic and methodological moderators of those links. So what did I expect to find? Well, first I expected to find a positive link between intrinsic aspirations and well-being. This is relatively non-controversial. There isn't very much debate in the literature about the well-being benefit of orienting toward intrinsic aspirations. That's a fairly simple hypothesis. Though I did also expect to find a positive link between extrinsic aspirations and well-being, which probably sounds counter to the theory I've just outlined. And in order to justify it, I need to go off on a little bit of a tangent and explain the 3 main ways in which the aspiration variables themselves are calculated. So first and most simply is just a simple mean across a domain or across a specific aspiration. So the mean across wealth, fame and image is the extrinsic mean, or the mean for wealth is the mean for wealth. Just simple scores. And within the effect sizes included in this meta-analysis, correlations that use those simple scores predominate. It's mostly correlations using these simple scores or absolute scores. But because goal contents theory doesn't specify that extrinsic aspirations are inherently bad, they just tend to be more detrimental to the extent that they are prioritized over intrinsic aspirations and crowd out opportunities for intrinsic pursuits. So in order to get at that, the centrality or the intrinsic emphasis of aspirations, those simple scores are often transformed in one of 2 main ways. The first is the calculation of a relative intrinsic aspiration index. So this is just the intrinsic mean minus the extrinsic mean. So that becomes kind of an indicator of intrinsic aspiring. If it's positive, you're more intrinsic. If it's negative, you're more extrinsic. And the relative centrality index takes the mean from intrinsic and extrinsic and subtracts the mean across all 7 aspirations. The reason for that is people certainly differ in the extent to which they subscribe to intrinsic, or they relatively emphasize intrinsic or extrinsic aspirations, but people also differ in the degree to which they aspire in general. And general aspiring is positively correlated with these indices of these good indices. If you're engaged with life, engaged with goals, kind of regardless of their content, it tends to be a good thing. So it's important to account for that general aspiring extent, and then you can see the extent to which intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations are central. So because I expected extrinsic aspirations of well-being to be positively correlated to begin with, because the correlations use mostly those simple scores, those absolute scores that contain that general aspiring element, So I didn't expect the effect size to be as strong as it is for intrinsic aspirations, but I did expect it to be positive because before the mean is subtracted out, it still reflects this kind of a general engagement with goals. So that's what this third hypothesis here is. I expected the link between extrinsic aspirations and well-being to be moderated by the method used to calculate the aspirations. So in particular, I expected simple correlations to correlate positively with well-being, but once the mean is taken out, I expected the correlation to reverse and become negative. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Hypothesis 4, aspirations are also measured on 3 different scale types. Importance is the most common, so it's important to be very wealthy. But they can also be rated in terms of their likelihood or attainment. So I'm likely to be very wealthy, or I'm already very wealthy. And the evidence suggests that the degree to which you think you're likely to achieve, or you feel you have already achieved your goals, boosts any positive impact of such aspiring. So I did expect the different scale types to moderate. In particular, I expected likelihood and attainment coefficients to be higher than the coefficients for importance. Age and gender were not expected to moderate the links. The differential link between intrinsic and extrinsic aspirations and well-being holds across age groups and isn't impacted by gender in the literature so far. Women do tend to orient toward intrinsic goals or rate intrinsic goals more highly than men do, but that doesn't affect the impact. It doesn't affect the link. So they weren't expected to moderate. And then the last one, and importantly, is this question of country. So attempting to settle this debate about whether in the West, on Western continents, extrinsic aspirations are bad, but in continents with developing economies, such as in the Eastern Bloc, extrinsic aspirations are not bad. So I didn't make a hypothesis about this, I just presented the claim and allowed the data to speak for itself. So what did I, obviously after using those research questions and hypotheses, I followed all the steps that everyone does for a meta-analysis, finding initially 3,400 articles and then screening them with James. We ended up with 64 articles available to include that had a total of 1,032 individual effect sizes that needed to be extracted. Now the reason there's so many individual effect sizes is because I went maximally inclusive in terms of the outcome measures. The literature uses many, many different scales as kind of proxies for well-being and ill-being. And I included everything that was discussed as a metric of well-being or ill-being in the meta-analysis. So well-being measures included things like Dina's satisfaction of life, basic psychological need satisfaction, of which there are many versions, positive affect, self-actualization, meaning in life, engaged living, happiness. And then indicators of ill-being were things like the many measures of depression and anxiety, negative affect, basic psychological need satisfaction, and distress, like the GHQ. So what do we find? So looking at the first hypothesized link between intrinsic aspirations and well-being, this forest plot here shows what the multitude of effect sizes, but at the bottom the pooled effect sizes, which are as expected and positive. So when intrinsic aspirations are presented in aggregate, the link with well-being, is 0.26, and then for specific aspirations for health, the link is 0.25, personal growth 0.25 also, community 0.18, and close relationships 0.19. Similarly, or I guess on the flip side, intrinsic aspirations correlate negatively with ill-being, though the coefficients were smaller than the links with well-being. So intrinsic aspiration appears to be a better boost of well-being than a protector against ill-being. Minus 0.13 for aggregate intrinsic, minus 0.16 for personal growth, minus 0.14 for close relationships, minus 0.13 for health, and minus 0.11 for community giving. Now, as far as the links between extrinsic aspirations and well-being, you can firstly see that it's much more of a mixed bag, so much spread between positive and negative effect sizes. And at the bottom there, you can see that all of the pooled effects are positive, but very, very weak. So global or aggregated extrinsic aspirations are 0.07, wealth 0.01, fame 0.05, and image also 0.05. And then the link to ill-being, there are less effect sizes here, but again, you can see it's kind of spread, but also, again, positive, to a kind of similar extent to the degree to which they predict well-being, they also predict ill-being. So obviously these effects are tiny, less than 1% of the variance, probably not phenomenologically impactful, but it indicates that they're just helping as much as they're hindering, significantly but very weakly. 0.05 for wealth, 0.07 for fame, and 0.06 for image. So it's kind of like they cancel each other out in terms of promoting well-being and promoting ill-being. And in terms of the moderators, what did I find? So measurement strategy, as explained before, was found to be a significant moderator of the link between extrinsic aspirations and well-being. As expected, simple correlations, absolute scores, correlated with well-being positively. But when you sucked out the mean, that link became negative. So the link, when you relatively emphasize extrinsic aspirations in your aspirational network, that's detrimental. But in principle, just as a kind of simple correlation, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Scale type was also a moderator, as I explained before. Likelihood at attainment boosted the positive impact of intrinsic aspirations to a coefficient of 0.13, and also attenuated the negative impact of extrinsic aspiring. Not obviously not with a massive effect size or anything, but turned it from negative to positive. Gender unexpectedly moderated the link between extrinsic aspirations and well-being. Ill-being, not well-being, ill-being. Finding that, so obviously that link is positive. Extrinsic aspirations correlate positively with ill-being. But in samples comprised of mostly males, that link went from 0.1 to 0.25, indicating that mostly male samples experience greater, increased detriment from extrinsic aspirations. Obviously, how do we explain this? I'm not exactly sure. In the thesis, I've theorized that perhaps men feel greater sense of social pressure to pursue extrinsic goals for wealth and fame and image, and such an experience of internal pressure might kind of exacerbate some of the detrimental impact, but I don't know. I wasn't expecting to find it. Age didn't moderate any of the links, and neither did country. So this answers the question of whether extrinsic aspirations might correlate positively or not at all with well-being in Eastern Bloc countries. Surely their logic applies in other countries, but it's only argued in the context of the Eastern Bloc. Didn't find any support for moderation by country or continent. So in general, the moderation analyses supported the universal applicability of goal contents theory. Though despite upholding its central tenets, the effect sizes were relatively small, and the standard errors, even though I didn't report them, were pretty big. So smallish effect sizes with largish effect sizes suggest considerable heterogeneity. And that's a complicated factor when we talk about future analyses of aspirations, because it indicates, well, obviously, as I said before and as I know you know, variable-centered analyses, which form the heart of the meta-analysis, depend on the assumption of homogeneity. And I'm suggesting that that samples that measure aspirations are heterogeneous. And we can't attribute any of that heterogeneity to more traditionally observed sources of heterogeneity, such as age, gender, country, socioeconomic status. They don't moderate the link. So it indicates that there's some unobserved source of variance present in these samples. And person-centered or pattern-centered approaches are designed to tackle such a problem. The aim of a person-centered or pattern-centered approach is to test for the presence of subgroups within broader samples for whom the pattern of responding, in this case the pattern of aspiring, differs. And then you can test the extent to which membership to those differing patterns is an important predictor of your outcome variable, in this case, well-being. So that's what I did in studies 2, 3, and 4 of the thesis. In the interest of time, I'm not introducing them to you study by study. The results, thankfully, were replicable and similar across the study, so I'm presenting them all together. So my aim was to answer this question: are there distinct subgroups for whom the pattern of aspirations differs? And then if I found different patterns of aspiring, reliable patterns of aspiring across samples, does membership to those patterns predict additional variance in well-being? And I did this using a combination of bifactor exploratory structural equation modelling and latent profile analysis. So this is what's a 2 global factor bifactor ESEN, and it works like this. So in the center, in the square boxes, we have each of the 35 items on the aspiration index, 5 items for 7 subscales. And each of those items loads onto 2 orthogonal factors. So on the top here, we have the extrinsic global factor and the intrinsic global factor. And if the extrinsic global factor, as an example, takes up variance shared across related aspirations. So wealth, fame, and image items all load on the global factor. These variables are all correlated. And so the global factor kind of accounts for the extent to which they are related to each other, leaving behind variance that is attributed to the orthogonal specific factors at the bottom. So the 2 global factor bifactor ESEN fit indices were great in the 3 studies that I used. So from that, I extracted 9 factor scores, 2 global and 7 specific, and then used those factor scores as the indicators in a latent profile analysis. So the latent profile analysis is the person-centered element of the study, and the aim of the latent profile analysis is to it evaluates the pattern of responding, or in this case, the pattern of factor scores for each individual in the sample, with the aim to extract groups of people for whom that pattern of factor scores is the same. So I did this, I used this combination of methodologies in 3 studies, using a total of 11,065 participants from 3 countries. So in study 1, I just tested for the presence of distinct subgroups. This was in a 3,370 person sample from Hungary. And then in studies 3 and 4 of the thesis, I attempted to firstly replicate those profiles, and in those latter 2 studies, I also tested the extent to which membership to those profiles predicted additional variance in well-being outcomes, and some ill-being outcomes too. So study 2 was from Australia, 1,632 school kids from the Australian Character Study, and study 4 is from America, 6,063 young adults between 18 and 25, which we recruited through Qualtrics. As I said before, the BESEN was a good fit for the data, and the latent profile analysis output in each of the 3 studies supported a 3-profile solution. And that 3-profile solution was the same across studies, or very, very similar. Now this is the 3rd or 4th time I've had the opportunity to present these profiles. And each time that I have, I guess I'm trying to improve the extent to which I communicate it, because it is a lot of information to kind of take in on what ends up being 9 graphs. And I really want to emphasize today the characteristics of the 3 profiles. But it's important that you know that they replicated, so I'm just showing that to you. It's too fast. So again, I don't want you to spend too much time getting oriented here, but this is study 1, study 2, and study 3, and then in each of them, profile 1, 2, and 3. So all your take home is supposed to be here is that aside from some kind of minor configural nuances, in 3 totally separate and independent large studies that are done across cultures, the profiles look really similar across the 3 studies. So this was obviously good for us in terms of finding replicable profiles, and I want to now introduce you to who they are, what the characteristics of someone typified by these profiles might be. So the first is profile 1. We called this profile disengaged from relationships and health. These labels are quite long, so I'm going to give you an image shortly that will help you remember these profiles. So what characterized someone who was from profile 1, disengaged from relationships and health? Well, they had below aspirations in general. So across all 9 possible scores, 2 global and 7 specific factors, they were below average. But they were more extrinsic than intrinsic. So even though their line sat beneath the mean on all of the factors, they were especially low on intrinsic, and their extrinsic orientation was higher. And they had especially low dips within the specific aspirations for relationships, low relationship aspirations and low health aspirations. So instead of remembering all of that, you can think of this person as Homer Simpson. Profile 2 is aspiring for interpersonal relationships more than community relationships. So the characteristics of people typified by this profile are average average aspirations across the board, so it's a relatively flat line. But they do have a peak for orienting toward close relationships. So average for pretty much everything, but an emphasis on their close network, on their close others. Or you can think of this one as Marge Simpson. And then profile 3 is aspiring for community relationships more than interpersonal relationships. So this is it's the flipped name of profile 2. This profile has above average aspirations in all domains. So their profile line is above the average for all 9 factors. However, so these people are just really engaged, but they are more intrinsic than extrinsic. They have the biggest ratio of intrinsic to extrinsic. So they're really engaged in all global and specific domains, but particularly oriented towards intrinsic aspirations in general, and with a notable peak for aspirations toward the community. Or Lisa. So these people are, oh, you guessed it. So these people were scoring highly on items such as it's important to work to make the world a better place, and it's important to do for others, asking nothing in return. So we got Homer, we got Marge, we got Lisa. So if you want to keep the Homer, the Marge, and the Lisa of it in mind, it will help, I think, to understand the forthcoming hypotheses. Because the next step, after replicating these profiles, the next step was to find or test for demographic predictors of profile membership. So does gender, does age predict your membership into one of these 3 profiles? And then secondarily, and perhaps more importantly, it was important to test the extent to which profile membership told us something we didn't already know. So obviously replicable profiles is exciting. I was certainly excited to replicate them. But beyond that, it's important that we test the ability of profile membership to predict variance in well-being above and beyond the aspirations. We already know that the aspirations tell us stuff about well-being and ill-being. So it's important to find out if profile membership tells us something that we didn't already know using a much more parsimonious method. So these were the hypotheses with those 2 aims, demographic predictors of and the extent to which profile membership predicts outcomes. I expected males to be more likely than females to belong to profile 1, so I expected males to be more likely to be Homers than females. I expected females to be more likely to be Marges and Lisas than males. So this is just, this hypothesis is born from the data. Women tend to report intrinsic aspirations more highly than men do, and they also tend to report aspiration, like score higher in general aspiring than men do. So given that profile 2 and 3 has above average aspirations in general and a relative intrinsic orientation, I expected these profiles would be, I expected these profiles to be predicted in these ways. Then hypothesis 3, I expected profiles 2 and 3, so the more engaged and the more relatively intrinsic profiles, to have more well-being than Homer. Marge and Lisa are happier than Homer, is the hypothesis here. But I also expected Marge and Lisa to score higher on indices of other orientedness. Now, hypothesis 3 here is again born from the data in the same way that the gender hypothesis is. These profile 2 and 3, Marge and Lisa are more engaged with goals and more engaged with intrinsic goals, and so following from the meta-analysis and from the theory in general, we should expect this group to report more well-being. And I tested that using a highly conservative test that we ended up calling the Darth Vader test, which uses profile membership as a predictor of the outcome variable whilst controlling for all of the factor scores. So, yeah.
The specific factor scores, the ones at the bottom or the 2 at the top?
All 9. Controlling for everything, yep. So putting it, sorry.
Is it
Thus Darth Vader, yeah, exactly. Taking out all that variance. So we used profile membership as a predictor, controlling for all 9 factor scores, the 2 global factors and the 7 specific factor scores. I did the same with hypothesis 4, but hey, Rafa. But the logic and theory underpinning this latter hypothesis, this 4th hypothesis, probably requires a little bit more explanation. Indeed, I've conceptualized the differences between these profiles as representing differences in what we've termed integrative span, which I'm going to explain now, I'm going to define now. So your aspirations in life can concern you. Indeed, extrinsic aspirations for wealth and fame and image are thought to be more self-oriented than other-oriented. So you want lots of money and you want to be famous and you want to be beautiful. But your aspirations can also concern your close others. So you can aspire to both have close relationships and you can aspire for your close others to have well-being. But there appears to be this third layer where that includes the wider community. So people who aspire to contribute to strangers and acquaintances, and also hope that those strangers and acquaintances have high well-being as well. So I'm mapping this ever-increasing span of integration, this integrative span, onto the shape of the profile. So profile 1 being red, profile 2 being green, and purple being profile 3. So the idea here being that if this hypothesis is true, if as we move from profile 1 to profile 3, people have broader integrative span, they should report higher scores on things like non-attachment and empathy and other indicators of other orientation. In other words, as a famous ogre once said, onions have layers and ogres have layers, and I'm suggesting that our social network, the extent to which we aspire for the benefit of others, is also layered, beginning with us, moving on to our close others, and then onto the community. Feasibly, it extends further than that too. You might transcend species or transcend time and care for those who have been and those who will come after us. So what did I find? Well, in terms of predictors of profile membership, the results were congruent with the hypotheses. Males were more likely to be homers and females were more likely to be leasers. We didn't find any differences on the Marge profile, they were equal. But men are more likely to be in that disengaged from relationships and health profile, and females are more likely to be orienting toward the community more than interpersonal relationships profile. Then using that really conservative test to predict the well-being outcomes, we also found that Lisa reported more social well-being. So this is, I like the way that, I like the structure of the world, I understand the world, and I am happy with my place in it. Engaged living, so engaged living is value congruent living and life satisfaction, and basic psychological need satisfactions. I won't define that for you. And also non-attachment. So they didn't differ in terms of the hypothesis 4, this other orientedness hypothesis. They didn't differ on cognitive or affective empathy once you control for aspirations, but they did differ on non-attachment. And this is across the latter two samples. So in the sample of kids from Australia and the sample of young adults from 18 to 25 in America, we found these differences. And in addition, the Homer profile reported the most basic psychological need, frustration, controlling for the aspirations. So what's next? Oh no, it's not all on there. I know, ignore. So what's next with these kinds of ideas with this theory? What do I plan to do with it next? So, well, the idea would be that this concept of integrative span has been born from the results that I've generated so far, but perhaps there are more explicit ways of tapping such a construct. Are there spheres of kind of connection to other people? How do those spheres relate to each other? How do those spheres relate to people's well-being? And then if it's found to be a reliable thing, perhaps we might want to ask questions like, do people move between the profiles? If they do, can we make them? Would we want to? And what things might predict movement between the profiles without intervention? I'm lucky to be able to drive forward some of these ideas with Rich for another 3 years, so we'll be answering some of these questions and I'll report back. So, it's 3 years and 4 studies and 60,000 words. What are the take-home messages? Well, first, the content of aspirations appears to matter for well-being. In particular, intrinsic aspirations promote well-being, and extrinsic aspirations are just neutral. They help as much as they hurt, weakly, not very much at all. There is no benefit. There also samples appear to be comprised of 3 reliable and replicable latent profiles of aspiring, and membership to those profiles predicts unique variance in the outcome measures. So unique variance in that this is obviously it's a regression. I used profile membership in a regression controlling for the aspirations, and that predicted additional variance in the outcome measures. And that's it. I obviously want to thank Baljinder and Rich. I have thanked them in person and obviously in writing, but it's been a real privilege to work with you both for the last 3 years, and I get to work with you both ongoing, which is great. Contributing to my, my personal state and my statistics and my writing, it's been a very fully rounded experience. I'm really grateful. Thanks so much. But I also need to thank Joseph, because he's been a co-supervisor basically without any contractual obligation to do so. And Phil is a co-author on the profiles paper currently under review, and James is a co-author So that's it. Great. How did it go? Oh, okay, 35. Somewhere in the middle. Any questions, any comments?
Did you ever directly compare, you summarize the effects of extrinsic and intrinsic. Did you ever directly compare, see those overlap? I mean, I assume that intrinsic is more strongly associated with well-being than extrinsic, but I never saw the explicit test.
I don't know what you mean.
You know how okay, so you've summarized in the meta-analysis the effect of intrinsic on, say, well-being.
Yeah.
And extrinsic on well-being.
Yeah.
Are those significantly different? I assume they are. I thought confidence.
Yeah, you're asking me to know the confidence intervals off the top of my head. I don't know.
It's quite striking if after all this research,
there's no
they haven't even
difference.
shown that it's actually higher.
That's true. Yeah. No, I don't know. Yeah. Yes, Ed?
A typical way of looking at this with, like what you did with the meta-analysis, looking at the correlations, that's fine. And then taking the mean, that's a sort of a funny one, but I think it's the same thing that if you put both of them into a regression equation and look at the unique effects
of each.
Would would it be the same?
Well, I mean, that's true. So I haven't actually been I guess that's a limitation of the meta-analysis in that some studies report just a standardized beta, controlling for some demographic factor or controlling for each other. And so including that, it's not very many of the overall effect sizes, but including that, it's just so different to the other effect sizes I wasn't able to include in meta-analysis.
Well,
I'm not
be
sure
because the beta weight is the equivalent of your mean.
To sucking out the mean?
Yeah.
So I could just include it as...
Well, what I'm saying, I'm pretty sure that if you use both the intrinsic and the extrinsic as predictors, that you're getting the unique effect of each controlling for the other, which is pretty much, I assume, what you're doing with this mean approach.
Yeah.
But it would be a lot stronger, and it would also allow you to look at the studies that have both of them.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, so I haven't done the transformation. It's just when people report only that centralized variable. So I haven't done any of the transformation.
It'd be easy enough to do. For the ones that do that, to see if you get different. I assume they present the correlations as well.
Sometimes, sometimes, not all the time. Yeah. There's also, exactly. So there's also, so people do that, include intrinsic and extrinsic simultaneously in a regression, but then they also do them separately. So extrinsic aspiring and controlling for total, which is, I understand exactly the same thing, but I guess it would be a challenge to justify including them all together as effect sizes at the same time.
Well, you can look at that with
like
the
another
data,
step.
with the data that you've got.
That's true.
Because you could use both ways and show that they are equivalent.
The same. Yeah, that's true. That's a good idea. Thanks. Anything else? Yeah.
The dark data test is a really interesting one. And I would think that you'd want to report the effect sizes with and without.
I do.
Okay.
In the paper I do, yeah.
Okay.
And the profiles are massively different before controlling for aspirations. So the pattern is really similar. Profile 3 is just off the Richter better than profile 1 and 2. But once you control for aspirations, a lot of those significant differences fall away. or just become minimized. But yeah, I do report both. Yeah.
Can you explain again just the mechanism that you think might be going on behind that, about how, like, even though, you know, Lisa's in the group and she's like having all of those aspirations is what causes her to be in the group, but also what potentially is causing big gains in her well-being. Yeah. Why does being part of that group influence all of those factors so much? Also, like, controlling for the aspirations that kind of got her into the group in the first place.
That's right, yeah, so the aspirations got her into the group, they're controlled for. She obviously reports highly on things in general, so that is controlled for by controlling for aspirations. I mean, what's left? It's just got to be some orientation toward the world. That's quite good. I mean, I think the variables upon which Profile 3 score really highly are informative. So social well-being and particularly non-attachment. So these people see the world in a positive light and experience their place within it positively, but unattached to that. So perhaps a kind of underlying presence of mindfulness or non-attachment might be a predictor, the kind of state you should be in order to move to or be in Profile 3, more so than an outcome. Of course, it's all kind of cross-sectional, so we can't look at anything causal. But were we able to, I would think some kind of non-attachment is probably, some kind of non-clinging is probably the best predictor of Profile 3 membership. Yeah.
The straight regression with the 9, those are only strictly linear effects.
That's right, yeah, that's
Whereas,
true.
The effects, if there's nonlinear effects, that interaction effects or quadratic effects or something like that, they can get picked up in the group membership.
In the profile, that's right.
In the profile, and presumably there's some of those nonlinearities, and I mean, who knows where they are.
Well, they are, exactly, yeah.
But it must be some of those that are contributing.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
because like if you pursue wealth, but you've also got a really high community orientation, then one can be a pathway to another. People talk about like earning to give, right? In which case wealth would not be hurting your well-being. In fact, it's sort of facilitates. So there's probably like the interactions and the contacts.
And with 9 factors is 9 by 7 two-way interactions.
That's right.
however many of this and however many of that.
So our journal editor actually asked for that. Wondered if we could create a 7-way interaction plot.
James could.
We didn't. So yeah, I do think it's, I mean, a question such as the one you just raised, Mike, is kind of like some of the idea or interest that underpin the asking of these questions in the first place. Like, is it possible that some people are aspiring for wealth for other reasons? Certainly these questions, it's not the first time these questions have been asked within SDT, but just the first time they've been tested in this way. Yeah.
Complimentary presentation and well done for us in terms of reducing complexity for people. So
thanks. Reducing complexity, that's a compliment I've never had before about this.
I just have one question about the aspiring, and you said that included likelihood and attainment.
In the meta-analysis, yes. In the profiles, no, just importance.
Oh, okay. I was just curious if there might be any difference between those two kind of states, someone who's on the journey versus someone who's not there.
Meta-analytically, so in the meta-analysis they were the same. They were both significantly better than importance, but not different from each other. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone.